All right. Well, the reason that we're all here is because right now there's an exhibit on at the Aqua Space in Edmonton, and it's something that I was part of working together with
Mhm.
Larissa Sembalyuk-Chilyadan, and we've compiled a whole bunch of stuff. And when we first started talking about this, the Aqua folks asked us if we could make an exhibit that talked about Ukrainian music in Canada. And we thought, well, that's kind of too giant a topic, so let's narrow it down a bit. So we decided let's go to Ukrainian music on the prairies of Canada. And even that's a pretty large topic to deal with. And so we tried to find some way to give it some parameters. And so we confined this now to talking about Ukrainian music on the prairies during the era of vinyl records. And the reason we chose that is prior to that time, there were people playing music, but it wasn't really recorded in any way. We don't really know exactly what they played. And uh, once it was put on records, now we have some kind of a way to keep track of this. And we thought we'd end at the era where people stopped making vinyl records, although they're making them again now. I just made one a couple of years ago. But when they stopped making vinyl records, because after that, once the people had home recording things and they could make their own tapes and CDs and things like that, it kind of exploded to a point where it's hard to keep track of as well. And the third reason we chose that era is because those vinyl records had really interesting covers. And Larissa's an artist, and so part of our display features a giant wall full of all kinds of records there. Uh, this exhibit, if you go see it at the Aqua Space, it has 6 panels that are designed to be on display right now at Aqua and then move to other locations. And those 6 panels describe 6 different eras. There's a little bit of an introduction about how people came to Canada and what music meant to them. There's a panel that talks about the early years in Canada. This is this time before recording existed, and so that consists mostly of photographs, but there's a few recordings there as well. Then we talked about the very first early recordings and also the role of radio programs. So you'll see some things like that. The next panel talks about the commercial boom that happened in the 1960s and 70s when this kind of recording of Ukrainian music in Western Canada exploded. And I'll explain to you a bit about what that is, and we'll play some of that for you. The next panel after that, it talks about the time in the 1970s and early 1980s when Canada was looking more at this idea of multiculturalism, and people were kind of encouraged to develop and foster their own individual cultures. And so music kind of changed a little bit during that time, but at the same time, some people continued on with the old traditions of the past. And then the last section that we have, it talks about musical instruments, and it shows you a bunch of different musical instruments. You'll see some of them here today. And besides these panels, the exhibit at the Aqua Space, it contains numerous artifacts. We have a lot of different kind of musical instruments that were lent to us by various musicians and families of musicians. We have some old music equipment, things like microphones and speakers and things like that. Those wooden stands that bands used to have, either for their music or for their personal items. And usually on the front there was a painting advertising the name of the band. And we also have some other things. Old gramophone where these records could have been played on, some old radios, and also, as I mentioned, a one whole wall that's covered with a variety of record jackets that shows you kind of the range of all the interesting stuff that you can see there. So I thought what I'd start with is the early years, that early section, and uh, when people first came to Canada from Ukraine at the end of the 1890s and the beginning of the 20th century, uh, you know, many of them didn't know what they were coming to. and most could travel with a limited amount of stuff. We probably all heard stories about people traveling, with all of their worldly belongings in one trunk, and that meant they had to bring their clothing and household items and sometimes religious things. They brought icons or books, church books. Sometimes they brought other kind of things for daily life. So some people brought grain and things like that, and a few people thought it was important enough to continue on their musical traditions from home. And so there are lots of written instances where families arrived and someone had brought with them a violin probably because it's the easiest thing to transport. Cymbala, this instrument that I played for you here, we'll get to in a second, a little bit too clumsy if you have a limited space. This is probably not going to bring this along with you, but violins certainly for sure. So the earliest kind of ensembles, they kind of mirrored what people remembered from their villages, and these people were predominantly from the western regions of Ukraine. So the instruments that they played and the kind of music they played reflected the music that they knew in their own villages back home. And excuse me, instrumental musicians mostly played for dancing at various social events, but they also played for special ritual events as well. So, for example, we hear stories about weddings that last for more than 3 days, and all of those days have a bunch of special kind of traditional rituals that have to happen when they make the wreaths for the bride and groom's head, or bake the special breads, or when the bride or groom have to ask their family for blessings for their wedding. There were songs that went with that, and also musicians played along with all of that sort of stuff. Those traditional ensembles, they mostly were led by the violin, and violin was kind of the main instrument for every one of those groups. This violin that I'm holding now, my great grandfather brought this with him from Ukraine when he came to Canada, and so knowing that they had very limited stuff. I know my Baba told me they had just one of those trunks, but this violin was important enough to him that he brought this along with him. So the violin was the main instrument, and it was most often accompanied by this instrument here called the cymbala. People said if you had a violin and cymbala, that's a whole band. And sometimes it was also accompanied by various kinds of drums. So they said if you had the violin and the cymbala and the drum, that's a whole orchestra. And so violin, pretty much everybody's familiar with. I don't know if I have to tell you too much about this, but most of those early groups, they were often made up of either friends or neighbors, or more often than not members of the same family. And again, I mentioned this was my great grandfather's fiddle. This was my mom's grandfather. So he played this violin, and he also made this drum. And my grandmother, when she was a young girl, they would play at weddings. So he would play the violin, and she played the drum. But as was common in those days, when she was in her later teen years, that's when she got married. So of course, it's not kind of appropriate for a young married woman to be out late at night playing at a wedding. So then her younger brother, took over playing this drum at weddings. And so that's one family group. I just want to show you a photograph. This photograph is actually part of the exhibit at Aqua. Wait, I'm going to come closer to the camera so you can see it a bit better. And so this is a photograph of my dad's father and his two brothers, and they were playing music kind of in the eastern part of Saskatchewan. My grandfather actually played the violin, but he could also play this Hawaiian-style guitar, which was popular in the 30s and 40s. This picture was from around the 1930s. And so they often would play with a cymbala and two violins. So they would either play in harmony, or one would play the tune and one would play another part, things like that. And then sometimes he would also play on this guitar. So when I was a young kid, uh, this grandfather here tried to teach me the violin. I played the violin. I play the violin very poorly, so I'm not going to torture you here tonight with too much violin playing. But I figured, since we said it's the most important instrument, this was the first song that he tried to teach me when I was probably about 7 years old, 6 or 7 years old. As I said, I'm not much of a violin player because everybody else in my family played the violin. My grandfather, my dad, and then later on, a bunch of my kids. One of my daughter's a professional violinist, so they didn't need more violin players. So I got relegated to the timbale, and so I figured what I'd do is I'll show you this for those that are not too familiar with the timbale. I often tell people that this is kind of like a piano without a keyboard. So if you looked ever on the inside of a real piano, it has many rows of strings. And when you play the keyboard of the piano, when you press a key down, it causes a hammer to jump up and strike the strings, and they start to vibrate and make all the sound. This has no keyboard. I have to play it by hitting those strings just with two of these wooden hammers. So it's kind of like playing the piano with two fingers. And this particular timbale, they're all kind of set up in the same way. They have rows of strings that are made up of multiple strings. For all of the ones from Western Ukraine and the ones that are popular in Western Canada, there's most often 6 strings in each row. So it sounds like, I didn't pluck them all there. Anyways, there's 6 of them that are all tuned to the same note. And the reason for that is it makes it a lot louder. The violin's pretty loud because it's a high-pitched instrument. And so this timbale, like, by having so many strings, it kind of increased its volume. It has, this particular one has 25 rows of strings. Probably in Western Canada, the most common ones had like around 18 or 20 and up to 22 or 24 rows of strings. So depending on how many there were, you had to add or subtract a few different notes from the way that it's tuned. And then I'm not sure how well you can see this, but it has 2 bridges. The bridge is the kind of a thing that lifts the strings up away from the body of the instrument so that they can vibrate better. There's a bridge on this side, and there's another one here in the middle. So this bridge here, the strings pass over it right near the place where these tuning pegs are, and then they travel all across and underneath this bridge here, so that this whole length of string can vibrate. And the longer strings play the lowest notes. So that works like that. And so all of the strings that you can play along this side of the bridge, they're the lowest notes on this instrument. In the center here, this bridge, these strings cross over the top, and you can play on either side of this. And what it does is this is positioned in such a way that it divides those strings up into 2/5 of the instrument and 3/5 of the instrument, so that how much of it can ring. And if you play on this side, it plays one note, and if you play on the other side, the same strings play a different note. And so that's a way that you can get more notes throughout the entire range of excuse me, of the instrument. They're attached to the body of the timbale on this side by little pins. These strings are just made out of wire, and they're wrapped around these pins. And then they go to this side, and these are little tuning pegs and you need to turn them with a tool like this. So you put this tool on there, and depending on how tight or loose you are, you can make it by tightening the string, you make the sound go higher, and by loosening it, you can make it go lower. So as I mentioned, there's 25 rows of strings here, 6 strings to every row. So on my instrument, I have 150 strings that I have to tune. And so one of the jokes of cymbala players, we say, you spend 3/4 of your life tuning your cymbala and 1/4 of your life playing out of tune, because it never really always gets there. I mean, you can get it in tune, but as soon as you take this outside and the wood starts to expand or contract, then it kind of throws it off. Now, traditionally, how this was played is people used to sit and hold the instrument on their lap. The other thing they could do, this instrument, I forgot to attach that thing, but it has 2 little hooks at the sides here, and you could put a strap around your neck and walk with this cymbala. I've done that with this instrument a few times. It's very heavy, and I got tired pretty fast, or sore neck, anyways. But people used to do this because what they would do is play walking back and forth from various parts of the wedding. So if something was happening, say in the house of the wedding, the musicians would play there. Then they might usually walk outside to the yard, because in the early part of the 20th century, lots of weddings happened in farmyards, and they would just build a platform for people to dance. So the musicians would come outside and play there for a while, then go back in. In the villages of Ukraine, when people lived close together, they would walk from the people's homes, perhaps to the church where people were getting married. In Western Canada, that's a little less practical, so so that didn't happen as often. But anyways, what was I going to do for you here? So what I wanted to play for you then is this is a song that, again, that comes from this early era, the pre-recording era. And the reason why I was able to learn this song is during the early 1960s, a famous folklorist named Robert Klimash traveled across Western Canada and made thousands of hours of recorded interviews with people, mostly the early pioneers who were still alive, and also their children or their families. And he collected all kinds of stuff from them, stories about how they came to Canada, but also things like folk tales, jokes, folk songs, descriptions of folk traditions, and also he recorded a bunch of music. And you might look up the National Film Board. He made a film once for the National Film Board that was looking at Easter traditions in East Central Alberta, and the film's name is called Luchak's Easter. And the first time I saw that film, I was already playing the cymbala, and in one scene, there's some cymbala music in the background, and I was interested to find out what that was. And years later, I came to know Dr. Klimash, and asked him once where that music came from, and he very generously sent me the recording of this. So he recorded this from a man in Manitoba. The man's name was Bill Gresiuk, and my dad remembered seeing him playing at a wedding a couple of times as well. And what he would do is play that cymbala, and at the same time, he would take a piece of film negative, you know, the old negatives that you put in the old-fashioned camera, and put it in between his teeth, and he could whistle on that negative, and it sounded like somebody playing the flute. So he would play sometimes the tune whistling and play something else on the cymbala, or sometimes play the things together. I don't know how to whistle on a film negative, and plus now we take pictures with our phone, so it makes it even more difficult. But I did learn how to play the cymbala part. So this is a series of tunes that belong to a part of the wedding ritual, and then there's some fast tune at the end. So it's let me move this too. One of the things I didn't mention about the cymbala, unlike the violin where you could keep pulling the bow across the string and make a note last as long as you want, how this works is basically you hit the string once and it just kind of, you get its initial sound and then it kind of vibrates for quite a long time after the fact. On my instrument, what I've done is I have a couple of pieces of felt that I've put in here that I can move back and forth to regulate how much those strings vibrate. So sometimes I want it to vibrate for a long time. Sometimes you want it to be a shorter sound, so I can make those a little tighter. And the other thing that you that you often have to do is, in order to make a note go for a very long time, what you do is have to continually hitting it over and over again. So, and based on how fast and how hard I hit those strings, I can change its volume as well while I'm playing. So if I start and hit it kind of not too hard, and then I can kind of increase that sound. And the last thing that's something you have to do here often as well is sometimes these notes, when they're side by side, they kind of clash with each other, and it kind of rings for a long time. And so to make the string stop, you have to use your fingers. So sometimes you have to keep your small fingers out in order to be touching various strings while you're hitting the next ones with the bunch of sticks. Now, so I mentioned these early ensembles, they usually had the violin, the cymbala, and then I mentioned the drum. And I told you that this particular drum was made by my great-grandfather, and that my grandmother played on it. Now, one of the things my grandmother told me was that to make a good drum, the skin had to be made from a mean dog. So most drums are made out of calf skin or goat skin, but for some reason, this was the story, was that this had to be from a mean dog. And I thought it was just a story my grandmother was telling me, but I actually asked many other people, and they told me the same kind of thing. So my great-grandfather actually tanned this particular skin. He made of the hoops. These things here now, these jingly parts, they've been replaced. I remember playing this when I was a kid, and what my great-grandfather had in these spots were bottle caps from old pop bottles. But later on, my great uncle, my Baba's brother, he replaced those. He thought they didn't look nice, so he cut some actual pieces of metal and put them in there itself. Unfortunately, somewhere over the years, this got damaged, so there's a little rip in here. So it's really not. You can play on it, but I choose not to because I don't want that rip to go farther. And in fact, this is not the first skin on this drum. This is already a replacement skin, because my great uncle told me a story. They were playing, so he was playing the drum and my great grandfather was playing the fiddle, and they were playing at one of these weddings, and the weddings last for hours and hours and hours. And he said there was some man who, he was partying hard and fell asleep for a while, and then later woke up, but in the middle of the night already. It's like 1 or 2 in the morning. My uncle told me he was only 10 years old at the time playing this drum, and he was already falling asleep. And the guy got up and said, hurrah, play. Why aren't you playing? And my great-grandfather said, well, it's a little kid. He's tired already. And so that sleeping guy, or formerly sleeping guy, took a knife and cut a hole in his drum. So they had to make a new skin for it. I have another drum here. I got this drum in Ukraine. So it's I think this is a goat skin, and it has many of these metal things, and it also has a series of bells on the inside here. And there's a couple of different ways you can play this. You can use a stick, and so it's often like that. You can use your hand. And so my grandmother told me when she was a girl, she used to play like, like like that, or. And then the other thing she said, this was the fancy trick you had to learn if you wanted to make a lot of tips. So what you would do is you would play for a while, and then with your thumb had to be a bit wet, and you could go like that. So you play, I'll do it again, like that, okay? And then if you want to be real fancy, then you play like that. So, pardon me? Oh, I heard somebody talking there, but I couldn't hear what you said. So it's difficult. I can't play all three together, so unfortunately you won't get to hear what the whole band sounds like. But in some places on the prairies, rather than this type of hand drum. Oh, and I forgot to say this as well. My Baba would call this drum reshitko, or resheto is another word for it. Some places they call bubun. They just call bubun, just means drum. But reshitko or resheto means sieve. And the reason is they had these tools that they could on the farm, where instead of this skin, it was a screen, and you would put grain in here and shake it, and the dust and dirt would fall through there, and then you'd be left with the pieces of grain that you could grind up on the inside. So that was why this is often referred to like that. But besides that, they often would play another kind of drum, and it was a bigger drum like this. Put it here. Not the best for my tzibala, but that's okay. I'll put it here so you can see it. So it's a big drum like this, and then it has a symbol on the top. But I'm going to turn it this way because I'm going to play it this way for you. And so what you would have is a mallet that often had some kind of felt or something soft on the end here, so that you could hit the big drum part with that, and then some metal or wire thing that you hit the cymbal with, and so it sounds like like that. You can hear this already gives quite a bit of low sound to it, so that it fills in lots of the parts that later on were taken over by other instruments, and we'll mention those in a second. But we'll set you back down there, drum. All right, and we're going to go to. I forgot to do this. So we're going to go to the next section now. It's the part talking about the early recordings and the role of radio. Now, one of the things that we've realized when we were putting this together, I have quite a large collection of 78 recordings. They were made most of them were made around the 1930s in the United States, but we realized that actually the very first recording was made in 1925 in New York, and it was made by a musician named Pavlo Humenyuk, and he originally made records for the OK record company, but most of the records he made were for the Columbia Music Companies. This is a Columbia record, and this is one of his early recordings there. And prior to this, we had no way of knowing. People just played what they knew in their own villages. And once stuff started getting recording on records, now all of a sudden you have something that you can refer to. That was a song for this kind of dance, or this was a song for this kind of ritual, that kind of thing. And so these records, again, if you're not familiar with them, some of you probably already are, they played at a faster speed, and they had one song on one side and one song on the other side. And so you would, if you wanted to hear many songs, you had to have a lot of these records. What they eventually did was package them together in something called an album. Oh, this one's not an album. I'll get it for you in a second. Hold on, just give me 1 second. I'll just reach it from the other side here. I picked up the wrong thing. This one's not made in Canada, but you'll get the idea. So what they would do is put many records together inside one of these folders, and so you could hear more than one song. This happened to be one made by the famous Ukrainian bandurist Capella from Detroit, and this is kind of like, if you think of your photo album, that has many pages. So that's why they call this a record album. That's why we continue to call those records that we have now albums. It's because they used to come in a thing like a big book like this. And so what was I going to say? There were many of the large American record companies that made Ukrainian records. And for example, that Homonyuk, he made records that were of various types. He had some that were the dance melodies, for different kind of village dances. He had some that were, and in fact, that Kolomeka that I played you at the beginning was from one of his recordings. Sometimes he had thematic records, so that would be not just music, but there were people singing and acting out different parts. And he made some Ukrainskie Veselya, like Ukrainian wedding, or Popravene, like the day after the wedding, that kind of thing. And so there was, it was kind of like listening to a little theater piece actually on a record. And sometimes you have to buy 2 or 3 records to get the whole story. And he had a whole series of comedy songs. There was a singer named Johannes Jukowski who would sing funny songs while Homonyuk's band was playing. And then he also made a series of records that were the music for the dances of the famous choreographer Vasily Avraменко. Avraменко was he came from a theater background, but he also did dance. And he traveled all across North America teaching Ukrainian dance to people. Prior to that, people just did whatever dances they knew from their village. And so that was the start of these kind of stage dancing, where you could dance at a concert and it had some kind of a set choreography. So originally what Avraменко would do is go to a place and ask who the local musicians were and teach them how to play those tunes so that they could play them while the people of that area learned to dance. But then eventually he came up with the idea of asking Homonyuk to record them all, and so that he could just travel around with a package of records and a gramophone, and he could play everything there. So I thought what I'd do, I'll play you a short bit of one of those dance tunes of Homonyuk's, or from the Avraменко repertoire. This goes to a dance called Kozak Podilsky, and this was actually one of the first tunes I ever learned how to play on the cymbala. So that's it. apologize that the light that I have on here so I can see made a funny reflection on these strings, so I get a bit of an error there. Now, besides these records being made in the United States, there was a record company in the U.S. Called Stinson Records, and here's one of their records. And they mostly, what they would do is get recordings from the Soviet Union, which included lots of records from Soviet Ukraine. And so they had records of the Capella, Bandurist Capella of Ukraine, not the one from Detroit, but the one that was in Ukraine, various choirs from Ukraine. Some of these recordings were like singers, opera singers, things like that. And then what they decided to do was make some recordings of North American things. And for some reason, they ended up in Canada and in East Central Alberta. And they recorded a bunch of different bands. So this particular record that I'm holding right now is Mitro Radomski and his band. So he made a number of records. This would have been in the early 1950s, making these records. Mitro Radomski, John Zelisko, who was from East Central Alberta, and also a fellow named Bill Boychuk, and he had a band called the Easy Aces. You may have heard of them in the past. And
yeah.
And so in Boychuk's band was playing the cymbala for him for a number of years was a man named John Dlugosh. And one of the first things I did as a student when I came to Alberta, I worked on a project collecting information about cymbala and the different ways that people in Alberta played the cymbala, especially looking at different generations, because at the time that I came there, there were still some very old men that were alive that were playing the cymbala. There were some middle-aged men, and there were a bunch of young people that were playing the cymbala, and there was some crossover that was the same, but quite a bit that was not the same at all, like unique things for each generation. And quite a few of certainly the old guys and the middle-aged guys said, too bad you weren't here earlier. You could have heard John Dlugosh, because he was probably around the best of all. And so I found one of those old 78 records of the Easy Aces, and they're playing a dance called Hutzulka. And so Hutzulka was a popular dance, obviously, in Ukraine, but also for a long time in Western Canada. And it's still popular in Ukraine. And the thing that I find interesting is I've been back to Ukraine many times, and the melodies that they play there for this dance are the same. They sometimes come in a different order, but many of the same tunes that were on this recording by Bill Boychuk and the Easy Aces with John Dlugosh playing the cymbala. So this is how that Hutzulka goes. Yeah. I mentioned that the next era that we have uh, uh, mm, represented in our exhibit at Aqua is talking about the commercial boom of the 1960s and 70s, and in that time, it kind of started a little preamble to that would have been in the late 1950s when some record companies in Winnipeg, there was a record company called Regis, another called Quality. There was a record company in Saskatchewan called New Era. And in Alberta, the Ukrainian Bookstore of Edmonton made a record label that they called DSF or sometimes DSLP if they made a big record of that. So they were making some records. And but in early 1963, I believe, there was a couple in Winnipeg. They were a husband and wife, and they used to play country music at some of the bars in Winnipeg. And another Ukrainian fellow happened to see them there and suggested, perhaps you should try. If you sang some of these songs in Ukrainian, we could probably make a record of that. And so the result of that was, well, first they made the small 45 record. Oh, shoot, I should have brought you one. Anyways, you've all seen those before. The kind with the big hole in the middle that you have to put a plastic thing in to play. They made a 45 RPM recording of This Land Is Your Land. The famous singers, they're called Mickey and Bunny. And then eventually they made a whole LP of that song, plus a whole bunch of other songs. Some that were English songs that they translated into Ukrainian, some that were Ukrainian songs that they made new arrangements of. And then they soon after that, well, actually, they made this record first, actually. It's called Ukrainian Country Music. So they were actually singing country songs that you might have heard on the radio in the early 1960s, except changing them to some words in English, some words in Ukrainian. And that popularity of those records, when I talked to the producer that made that first record, he suggested that they sold somewhere between 80 and 100,000 copies of that This Land Is Your Land record, which is crazy at the time. Like rock bands in Canada didn't sell that many records. And so this was a huge success. It generated money for the record company, whereby they could go out and record all kinds of other artists. And so they had other people that tried making country music, but lots of it was just local bands playing the traditional dance music and all that sort of stuff. I'm not going to sing you any country and western songs because we don't have time for that. We're getting close to the. I've been talking too much and playing too little. So I'm going to skip over to play a couple more tunes of Tsimbola and then some other weird instruments just for a bit of a break there. I was going to say as well that during that boom era, it was also a time where you still had Tsimbola in a lot of bands, and of course the violin was still king for most of those records. I could play you a bit more violin playing, but my violin playing was kind of bad. But it's also a time when the accordion kind of took over in popularity, and up until the accordion really wasn't popular in North America or that popular until after the Second World War. Lots of people were in Europe and saw accordions there, and I guess brought back records of them. And so the accordion had great popularity in the 1950s and 60s, and so then Ukrainian bands started using them. And one of the reasons for that is because you could do a lot of things with an accordion. So besides playing the tune on this section, it looks like a piano. It also has all these buttons on this side where you can play bass notes and whole chords like that, right? So you can play the parts of really three musicians all at once, and it's also, you can tell pretty loud, and so it helped. It helped, especially if you were playing, outdoors or one of those things. It filled in a lot. So I mentioned Mickey and Bunny there. Their backing group, the musicians that used to support them while they were playing their concerts and stuff, was a band from Winnipeg called the Drifters Five, and I knew them very well because my mom's brother was their drummer, and so I used to hear them playing a lot when I was a kid. Sometimes they would let me come to their rehearsals and listen to them practicing and things like that. So I learned a lot of music just listening to them. The guy that was the leader of that band was a guy who played the accordion. His name was Dave Romaneshin, or his stage name was Dave Roman, just made it shorter from he left off the Ishin, and he was probably one of the most influential accordion players in Western Canada. Partly because they sold so many records, so a lot of people heard his playing, and then also he had I can't play all the fancy stuff that he could do, and then he also had one of the first electronic accordions in Western Canada as well. He had to order it special, like it was specially ordered and brought into Winnipeg for him, so that he could play not only accordion sounds but some other kinds of sounds on his thing. So that spurred other bands to try using an instrument like that. I'll just play you a tiny bit of one of their tunes. So they played all kinds of other tunes, but they made a whole record that was of also those dance tunes of Vasily Avarmanko, but some other Ukrainian dance melodies on there, including I'll play you two short Ukrainian wedding marches. So that's what they played. So they had. There you go. So you can hear that if you look back through the old records, you'll find them playing those tunes like that. Um, I was going to also mention it's instruments that I do not play. Also during this era of that boom, it's when you see a lot more of other kind of instruments being added to Ukrainian ensembles. So that's when guitars, especially the electric guitar, became popular. The electric bass, and then things like the saxophone. Some bands had the trumpet or clarinet, things like that. So they filled in with a lot of stuff like that. The next section that's in Aqua's display, it talks about. Oops, I skipped the page someplace? Ah, here it is. It talks about the time, as I mentioned, when multiculturalism was really popular in Canada, or became more popular, and so people were trying to have a kind of outward expressions of their own traditional cultures. And you might have noticed. I mentioned Mickey and Bunny. They don't sound like Ukrainian names. Their real names were Modest Sklepovich, and his wife's name was Oresia. But lots of bands took on all these kind of English-sounding names. D Drifters. They're all kind of drifters. There was the D Drifters and the Polka Drifters and the Drifting Cowboys and all of these other kind of things. And then uh, different types of troubadours and the various kings, polka kings, and the royal polka kings, and the interlake polka kings, and all this kind of stuff. So they all, but all these various kinds of English sounding names. And in this 1970s era, people started looking for things that sounded more Ukrainian. So now instead of calling yourself the Polka Kings, bands called themselves things like Dumka or Estrada or Volia or things like that. These type of names, Maria, and they started, those old bands. I mean, you can see in this picture, Mickey's wearing a tuxedo and a bow tie, and his wife's wearing a fancy dress, and in the 70s era, people started wearing, more often embroidered shirts, or they're not from the prairies, but you also had the influence of these bands from Eastern Canada, like Rushnichok, who would dress up, in Cossack Sharabare and all that sort of stuff while they were playing, and so you had all that kind of influence of those things. Partly it was because there were many people who arrived in Canada after the Second World War, and they had different tastes than the early generations, who were mostly the farming people that settled in the rural areas. And so though recordings made in the 70s often featured more composed songs, like written by composers in Ukraine, as opposed to the traditional folk songs. Sometimes they took songs that people sang in choirs and made arrangements out of that for their recordings, that type of thing. And at the same time, two other things were happening. So you had bunch of bands playing this kind of new and pop music sounding kind of music. Second thing that happened around that same time is some of the dance ensembles in Western Canada started making recordings of the music that they used for their stage dances. So starting with, the famous Alberta groups, first Shumka dancers, Chiramosh dancers after them, and then many other dance groups across Canada kind of followed their lead and did the same thing, releasing records of their music from their dance shows, from their stage dance shows. And so it also gave young people listening to records, a different thing, other than just the old kind of farm dance music. Already, here's another way that you might be able to interpret Ukrainian music. And then the last thing that they happened at that time was, you know, still following that wave that happened in the 60s, there were still a lot of bands, local bands, that were making recordings that they would sell at their dances and various other things like that, and the continuing on that previous tradition. Now, I mentioned those recordings by the Edmonton dance ensembles, especially Shumka and Chiramosh. Those recordings were mostly produced by Eugene Zvozdetsky, who was a local musician, and he wrote arrangements for those groups and put together their orchestras and all that sort of stuff. And then at the same time, uh, his brother Willie Zwozdetsky was also a musician and a composer and writing music. And an interesting project that he did combined two different things. So he had some of that orchestral music, like you might have heard on the music of the dance groups, but he found an old cymbala player in Edmonton named Nick Miski. And Nick came to Canada in the 1930s and had been playing for many, many, many years. And so at this time, like in the late 70s, early 80s, uh, uh, they recorded Nick, a bunch of Nick's cymbala pieces that he played, and Willie Zwozdetsky wrote arrangements for a small orchestra to support him. And again, I mentioned that one of the projects I did when I first moved to Alberta was studying different cymbala players, and Nick was one of the people that I talked to very often. And even after my project was done, we continued to be in contact and get together and play music, things like that. And he was probably by far, after I mentioned that John Dlugosh in the early 50s and early 60s, who was great. And in that time, Nick Miski was probably among the finest of the cymbal players then. And so this is one of the songs off of that record that he made with Willie Zwozdetsky. And so this is the way Nick played Povi Viter. Some of this. Around the same time, as I mentioned, some of the local bands were still making the old style music, and there was actually a Western Canadian style of cymbala playing that developed. And Nick still he learned how to play the cymbala in Ukraine, but some of these other fellows learned already. They're second, third generation people in Canada, learned from playing here on the prairies. And so here's one of the. If you go to the if you go to the exhibit at the Aquaspace, we have one of the. We have an area that's set up that looks like a band whole setup. There's a drum kit, there's an accordion, violin, there's some speakers, a microphone, and also a couple of those sign things that the people put in front of the stage, and one of them is a sign for the Country Masters, which was a local band here. And their cymbala player was a guy named Bill Semeniuk. And Bill was also he was a great cymbala player, but of this Western Canadian style. And so this was his favorite song whenever we played with him. The first song he always wanted to play, he used to call it "Dust Behind the Harrows." So it's and it kind of continues on like that. I know we're getting short on the time, so I'm trying to edit a little bit here for you. And I know we're at 11:33. So Josh, you tell me when we have to shut stuff down. I thought maybe that kind of took you through all of the various sections. I encourage you, if you have not been there yet, go and have a look at the exhibit that's at the Aquaspace. What we did is next to the many of the photographs or photographs of record albums, there are QR codes that you can scan with your phone, and we've made a collection of recordings so you could hear what some of the different sounds are from each of those various eras, besides hearing my sort of simple version of it here. Um, let's see, what was I going to do for you next? I'm going to take a sip of water here because I've been talking too much. And I also.
Hey, Brian. Hi,
Yeah.
everybody. We have about 10 minutes before the Zoom ends, just so
Okay.
you know.
I wonder if you like, maybe what we could do is, if folks want to ask some questions first, they could do that, and then if not, I'll show you a couple of strange instruments that sometimes showed up on the prairies, but rarely.
Don't worry about raising your hand. Just ask the question if you're interested.
Here, go ahead.
Anybody?
No.
Nope. He's pretty thorough, isn't he? He knows his stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I thought I'd tell you a couple of things. One of them was this instrument here. It's sopilka. It's one of the things that would have been in some of the early bands in Western Canada. We know this because, again, I mentioned Robert Klimash, who went across the prairies, recording various people and asking questions. And I listened to one recording of a man playing a bit of the spielka, but mostly talking about that instrument. This could be made out of wood or it could be made out of metal. You might notice here on my wall, I've collected a couple of them besides the ones that I play regularly, and it just sounds like any kind of wooden flute. And um, I'll just play you a quick. Here's a dance tune, Arkan. So. Another kind of flute that I encountered first in Ukraine, but then met a guy in Western Canada who could actually play this pretty well. It looks like this, and it's called tilinka, and it's the same kind of thing, but it has no places for your fingers. And so you play it by just blowing air at different speeds. And the faster you blow, the higher the note goes. So it goes like that. And then if you put your finger at the end here, you can change each one of those notes a little bit, like that. And so by blowing fast and slow and opening and closing that hole, you can play. Now, one instrument that was on the prairies, because I've actually went and talked to this gentleman myself, is an instrument that looks like this, and it's called the lira. And lira it's kind of like a giant violin, but instead of rubbing the strings with a bow, it has a wheel here that's covered with rosin. And to make the wheel move, it has a crank on the back. So you turn this, and it makes that kind of sound. So one of the strings plays the melody, and you do that by pressing these little pieces of wood that are inside this box. And the other two strings just play the same note over and over again. And in music, they call that a drone. It's kind of the same as bagpipes have a drone, where it just plays the same notes over and over again. And so in Winnipeg, there was a guy, his name was Vasil Hovika, and he was a shoemaker. That was his main job, but he actually had, I don't know where he got those instruments from, but he had a couple of liras, and he remembered the music that was played in his village back in Ukraine. And I was able to go and hear him play a few times. And uh, he was in Ukraine. What these who played this instrument were mostly blind musicians, and they're mostly like street beggars. They would play at marketplaces and churchyards and places like that, and they sang all kinds of different songs, historical songs and religious songs and things like that. Again, I'll play you one song. I won't play the whole thing because they go on forever, of course. And but just to give you a idea what it sounds like, this is another song that I learned from those recordings made by Robert Klimash, and it's a song that talks about a guy who's dying, and so he asks, could you gather my family around because I think it's my last moments. And before they arrive, he dies. But then he sings. He's still singing the rest of the song because he sees them there, and he describes how they're building his coffin and how they carry him to his funeral and all that sort of stuff. So it sounds like this. Святий Боже, святий кріпкий, давай святий безсмертний, болить мене, моя гонівонька, ой Боже ж мій кажу, Боже. And it goes on for a long time after that. So when I'm playing this, I often take instruments to schools. When I'm playing them there for the school students, I often tell them, in the old days they didn't have TV or internet, so instead of watching a show for 20 or 30 minutes, you had to listen to some old man play an instrument for 20 or 30 minutes. I guess the last thing I'll show you, because our feed's going to end, and or is it ending already, Josh? Sure. And it's the longest instrument I have. I'll show it to you like this. So it starts there, and then it keeps going on and on and on and on and on. So part of it will not be in your screen, and it's called the trembita. I mention it because if you go to our display, We have that one of the albums by the band from Alberta named Trembita. But Trembita means this long horn, and it's the way they used to send messages to shepherds up in the mountains. So you blow on it like this, and it sounds. And I won't play you any more of that either. You get the message there. I think we'll stop. I'll stop there. Thanks again for being part of this. I really encourage you, if you haven't been yet, go to the Acura Space in downtown Edmonton. Have a look at that exhibit. Thanks again to the Aqua people for inviting me to do this presentation and for inviting me to work on the project for them. Thanks to Larissa Sembeliuk-Chilyadan, who was the co-curator of this exhibit. She did most of the design work and collected a lot of information. Thanks to the Acura staff, Josh and Robin and their board, who had the idea for this project. And also to, again, you can look it up on their website. There's a whole list of all the people who were there, gave funding for this project, people who donated information and artifacts, all that sort of thing. So thank you to all of them.